Some battles never end. They don't stop when the guns fall silent. Some battles linger in the air, their echoes forever seared into the land, haunting the ground where lives were lost, where men fell and were left behind. And it's in these places, forgotten by time, where strange things begin to happen. Voices from the past, flickers of shadows, unexplainable sightings. For some, these sights are a gateway to the past, a past that refuses to be buried. One such place exists, where the sounds of battle never fade. A platoon that vanished without a trace, a group of young men once full of life, now reduced to whispers on the wind. The Ghost Platoon, a name whispered in military circles, a name that holds a chilling legacy. The question remains, what truly happened to them, and why do their voices still echo through the empty land years after their disappearance? On the eve of a pivotal battle during the final days of the war, the Ghost Platoon was given one last mission, a mission to secure an area that could change the tide of history. Their orders were clear: infiltrate, eliminate, and hold. They were young, eager, filled with the bravery and resolve that only the heat of war can instill. But when they left for that mission, something shifted in the air. The ground they walked on was never meant to be walked upon. They never returned. No bodies, no survivors, only the silence of an unfinished battle and an empty battlefield waiting to be disturbed. Some say they were simply lost, forgotten in the chaos of war. Others whisper that they were sacrificed, their lives extinguished by forces beyond their control, beyond human comprehension. And yet, the question remains, where did they go? What happened to them, and why is the battlefield still haunted by their lost souls? Years have passed since that mission, but still, the battlefield calls. Whispers and screams have been heard by those who dared to visit the area. Soldiers returning, tourists unknowingly wandering onto sacred ground, and even investigators have all experienced the same unsettling phenomena. What was once thought to be a quiet, abandoned place is now a site filled with paranormal activity. Voices calling from the dark, figures caught in the corner of your vision, shadows of men who should not be there. Why do the voices of the Ghost Platoon still haunt this land? Are they trapped in the moment of their death, forced to relive their final mission over and over, or is something else at play, something that has bound their souls to this place? The truth of the Ghost Platoon has remained buried for decades. Military records were sealed, and the area surrounding their disappearance was declared off-limits. But some have never stopped searching for answers. And the voices? The voices grow louder with each passing year, demanding to be heard, calling out from beyond the grave. Tonight, we will begin the investigation. We will seek the answers that have eluded us for so long. What happened to the Ghost Platoon? And what does their haunting presence mean for those who still walk the battlefield? Late in the war, deep within hostile territory, a platoon of soldiers was tasked with a mission that seemed routine. Their objective: to secure a vital area that could change the course of the conflict. The location was far from civilization, isolated and treacherous, surrounded by dense forests, rolling hills, and jagged terrain. The time was evening as dusk settled across the battlefield. In those final moments of daylight, the air was thick with an unease that no one could explain. The mission seemed clear, the objective within reach. Yet, as they marched into this desolate land, a sense of foreboding began to build. A feeling that they were not meant to be there, that this land had been waiting for them long before their arrival. The platoon, young and full of resolve, was unaware that they were about to step into something far beyond the scope of their mission. As the platoon advanced, their footsteps echoed off the empty land. Yet there was no return sound, no birds calling in the distance, no rustling of the wind, nothing but silence. But it was not the quiet of peace. It was the silence of something watching, something waiting. The stillness hung in the air, like a warning they couldn't yet understand. As the platoon pressed on, the discomfort became palpable. A coldness swept through the men, a chill that seemed out of place amidst the fading warmth of the day. At first, they attributed it to fatigue or the onset of nightfall, but the feeling persisted, pressing in around them like a wall. The air itself felt thicker, harder to breathe. Something in the atmosphere had shifted, and yet none could quite articulate what was wrong. Then the voices began. Faint whispers carried on the wind, whispers that seemed familiar and yet foreign. The soldiers thought it was another unit nearby, but as they drew closer to the source, they realized something far more troubling. The voices weren't coming from a specific direction. They seemed to come from all around them, as though the very air was filled with them. Not in any language they knew, but soft, distorted, impossible to ignore. Some men started to ask if they had heard it too. Some denied it. Others remained silent, pretending not to hear the distant, eerie call. But it was impossible to shake the feeling that they were not alone. As the whispers grew, the platoon tried to focus on the mission ahead, but it was becoming harder to keep their minds on the task. They were used to the sounds of war, the clamor of battle, but this was different. The land itself felt like it was closing in around them, and the air grew unnervingly still. And then, just as the platoon rounded a ridge, the first man vanished. One moment, he was at the front, walking with the rest, and the next, nothing. No sign of struggle, no blood, just empty space where he once stood. The platoon halted, calling out his name, but there was no reply. No sound but the rustling of the trees in the distance. The fog closed in around them like a blanket, smothering any chance of clarity. They searched frantically for the man, combing the area, but there was no trace of him. It was as if the land itself had swallowed him whole. One soldier swore he heard the man's voice calling his name from the distance, but when he turned to look, there was only emptiness, a vast, unbroken fog. As they continued, the disappearance seemed almost too surreal to comprehend. The land was quiet again, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was oppressive, as though the very earth was holding its breath. And then, just as they began to gather themselves, another soldier vanished. This time, no trace, no sound, only the steady echo of his absence. Panic began to settle in, but they had no choice but to press forward. There was nowhere to turn, no retreat, only the mission, and the eerie feeling that something unseen was moving with them. The men could feel it now, the weight of the land pressing in on them. With each step, the terrain seemed to change. The familiar path they had followed now felt foreign, alien, like they had somehow crossed into a place outside of time. There was nothing but empty space and the distant sound of voices that never stopped calling out, always just out of reach. As the platoon advanced deeper into the mist, their mission took on a life of its own. It was as if they were no longer fighting for victory, but merely trying to survive in a world that was no longer their own. They had become the prey, and the land, this cursed place, had become the predator. But just as they reached the location they were sent to secure, the last of them vanished. No sound, no struggle, just an empty stretch of ground where the men had stood. When the battle ended and reinforcements arrived, there was no sign of the platoon, only their abandoned gear, scattered around the battlefield like remnants of a nightmare. Reports were filed, official statements were made, but no one could explain what happened. Some believed the platoon had been overwhelmed, but there was no evidence of enemy action. No bodies, no remains, nothing to suggest they had even fought. Only the eerie silence that followed, which seemed to persist long after they had gone. The battlefield had claimed them, and in the years to follow, it would keep calling out for them, for anyone willing to listen. The battle had ended. The echoes of gunfire, the screams of soldiers, all silenced as the dust settled. But when reinforcements arrived to survey the battlefield, they found something unsettling. The platoon was gone. No bodies, no signs of enemy engagement, just the remnants of their abandoned gear, scattered across the field like forgotten relics. The area was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. The ground, stained with blood, held no trace of the men who had fought there just hours earlier. It was as if they had never existed. Official military reports came in. The platoon was simply lost in action. The reason for their disappearance was never truly explained, and the cause of their deaths remained a mystery. But for those who were there, the silence that hung in the air after the battle spoke volumes. Something about the absence, the emptiness, did not sit right. It was as though the land itself had taken them. No enemy could be found, and yet the sense of something missing was undeniable. As the days turned into weeks, the battlefield remained undisturbed. But the men who had fought there could not shake the feeling that something was still there, watching, waiting. They had walked that land, fought beside the soldiers of the Ghost Platoon, but the memory of their comrades was not the only thing that lingered. As time passed, strange reports began to surface from soldiers stationed near the site. Those who remained reported hearing voices, faint, almost imperceptible at first, whispers, calls, names being shouted into the wind. They would turn, expecting to see their comrades or reinforcements, but there was no one. The whispers were always too distant to approach. Yet they could not shake the feeling that they were not alone. The shadows in the distance seemed to move in ways that defied nature. Figures, indistinct and fleeting, always just on the edge of vision. A feeling of dread filled the air, stronger than any normal fear they had known. Reports flooded in of soldiers hearing phantom footsteps following them as they patrolled the area. It started as an occasional rustle behind them, the unmistakable sound of boots in the dirt, yet when they turned, no one was there. The footsteps would stop when they stopped, only to resume again when they walked on, closer this time, heavier. The soldiers described a growing urgency in the sound, as if someone was trying to catch up with them, someone who had never been there. One soldier, while walking through the area, heard the footsteps close in behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see another member of the patrol, but no one was there. He checked again, and when he turned back, he saw it, a shadow moving swiftly in the distance. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't another soldier. It was something else, something unnatural, something that shouldn't have been there. But when he approached, the figure vanished into the mist, leaving him with nothing but the sound of his own breath and a sinking feeling in his chest. As the days turned to weeks, the sightings became more frequent. Soldiers spoke of shadowy figures, figures that appeared on the edges of their vision, lingering just out of reach. Some said they saw the figures standing motionless in the distance, while others claimed to have seen them moving along the tree line, only to vanish when approached. These figures, standing tall and eerily still, were always shrouded in darkness, as if they were part of the shadows themselves, waiting for someone to notice them. Some soldiers claimed that the figures were the men of the Ghost Platoon, still trapped in the moments before their disappearance, haunting the land, unable to move on. They spoke of hearing voices that called them by name, beckoning them into the fog, urging them to come closer. But when the soldiers tried to answer, the voices would fade, leaving them with only the heavy silence of a battlefield that had become far too familiar. At first, the reports were dismissed as the product of tired minds and overactive imaginations, but as the accounts became more frequent, something had to be done. Investigations began, some officially sanctioned, others by those driven by the need to uncover the truth. But each investigator who arrived came back with the same reports. The battlefield wasn't empty. It had been changed, and its inhabitants had not left. It seemed as if the Ghost Platoon was still there, walking the earth long after the end of the war. Months passed after the battle, and the land, once calm, began to stir again. But this time, it wasn't the sound of soldiers marching. No, it was something else, something unsettling. Reports started coming in from soldiers, locals, and even passing travelers who spoke of hearing strange sounds near the battlefield. Faint cries that could only be described as screams from the past, desperate shouts, orders barked out into the stillness, and above all else, footsteps. Footsteps echoing through the fog, moving closer, following them, but when they turned, there was nothing to see. At first, these reports were dismissed as the result of stress, fatigue, or the mind playing tricks. But as the incidents grew and the accounts became more detailed, something more than just imagination was at play. Locals spoke of hearing men's voices, clear as day, even though the battlefield had long been deserted. And then, paranormal investigators, curious, skeptical, but willing to explore, arrived. Their task was clear: to record evidence of these bizarre occurrences, to capture what many were beginning to fear was no longer a coincidence. The investigators set to work, confident that the truth would eventually reveal itself. They documented every eerie noise, every whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. The first few attempts yielded nothing until the EVP recordings. The voices, distorted at first, but unmistakable. Names were called out. The voices were too clear, too distinct to be dismissed. It was as if the soldiers were reaching through time, desperate to make contact from beyond the grave. And what was more unnerving, those voices weren't calling to each other from the past. They were calling to the living, the investigators themselves. As the investigators continued to explore the field, they began to capture more. Shadows moving across the ground, figures standing just beyond the reach of their flashlights, figures that seemed to disappear as soon as they were noticed. And, worst of all, photographs. Photographs that showed soldiers who had never been there. Men in uniforms long since gone, standing among the ruins, their faces as clear as day, though they had no place being in the frame. Some of the figures were so sharp and defined, it was almost impossible to deny what they were seeing. As the investigation deepened, the evidence began to take a more disturbing turn. Shadows were seen moving unnaturally. Sometimes they stretched impossibly long. Other times they seemed to shift with the wind, too fluid, too deliberate to be caused by natural forces. A strange coldness settled over the land, and the deeper the investigators ventured, the stronger it became. Some reported feeling a pressing weight on their chest, an oppressive sense of dread that gnawed at them as they stood in the heart of the battlefield. And then there were the voices again. One investigator, holding a camera, caught something on film that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he zoomed in on an empty stretch of land, a shadow emerged from the trees, moving swiftly as though it were aware of the camera. But when he blinked, the shadow was gone, leaving nothing but a lingering static hum on the footage. The air around them seemed to distort as if time itself was being twisted, as though the land was trapping them in a moment that wouldn't let go. But it wasn't just shadows. The voices returned, clearer this time, louder, stronger. Men calling to each other, demanding answers, asking why they hadn't come back. The voices spoke urgent words, as though they were trapped in an endless loop. The investigators could not explain it. The voices carried the weight of the platoon's final moments, as though they were desperately trying to communicate, to be heard, even if it meant staying in the world of the living forever. As the night drew on, the investigation continued, and the air grew heavier. Some of the investigators were so overwhelmed by the sense of unseen presence that they had to leave. One man claimed that as he entered the area where the platoon had vanished, he was struck with an overwhelming feeling of suffocating sorrow. He said he heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, no one was there, just the heavy silence of the battlefield, now filled with the voices of the past. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became. The ghost platoon was not a legend. They were not mere figments of imagination. They were the remnants of men who had been lost, but not gone. Their souls, their voices, were trapped in a place where the boundary between the living and the dead no longer held. And now, those voices, the ones calling for help, still reverberated through the earth, endless echoes of a battle that had never truly ended. Years passed. The war faded into history, but the battlefield remained, a place frozen in time, untouched by the world around it. But even as the world moved on, the echoes of the ghost platoon did not fade. They lingered, like a shadow that refuses to leave. Soldiers, civilians, even strangers passing through the area, all reported the same strange occurrences. Some claimed to have seen figures, soldiers walking in formation, lost in an eternal loop, trapped within the very ground they once fought to defend. Others reported hearing the same whispers, the same voices calling their names, as if the past was still alive, still calling for help. Investigators returned to the site, eager to uncover the truth, to solve the mystery of the platoon's disappearance. But the answers they sought eluded them. Were the men of the ghost platoon simply lost in the chaos of war, overrun by the madness of the battlefield? Or had something more malevolent taken them, something beyond the grasp of human understanding? And if it was the land itself that claimed them, why were their spirits still tormenting the earth, unable to move on? As the years passed, the reports never stopped. Modern-day soldiers, stationed near the old battlefield, continued to hear strange noises, voices calling out from the ruins. They would turn, searching for the source, but find only the dead, empty land. Some saw figures, Soldiers in full uniform, walking through the fog, only to vanish when approached. Others heard the same desperate cries, the names of men long gone, still searching for an answer, still pleading for recognition. They were trapped in their final moments, forever bound to the land they had fought on, the Ghost Platoon. Men who had given everything for a cause they barely understood had become prisoners of the battlefield, their spirits unable to escape the place where they had fallen. The sounds they made were not of the living, but of those lost between the realms, still fighting battles they would never win, still calling out to anyone who could hear. The battlefield remains a silent witness to the struggles of those long gone, and the question still hangs heavy in the air. What happened to the Ghost Platoon? Were they just victims of war, caught in a conflict that took more than just their lives? Or were they taken by something darker, something beyond the comprehension of mere mortals? Something that bound them to the earth, to that very place, forcing them to remain forever stuck in their final moments, trapped between life and death, never to move on. Time may have passed, but the legacy of the Ghost Platoon lives on, etched into the land they fought to protect. Their voices still haunt the air, their final cries still reverberate in the wind. And no matter how much the world moves forward, their story remains unfinished, a tragedy never allowed to rest. So the question remains, were they just soldiers lost to the tides of war, or were they something more? The lost souls of the Ghost Platoon, forever tied to the earth they fought to protect, remain a reminder of the unseen price of battle. And as long as the battlefield stands, their voices will continue to echo, and their presence will linger, forever waiting to be heard.